You've been stealing $1,500 from the money I sent. It's over between us today. Aren't you ashamed as a mother-in-law? Apologize to Kathy. Both my husband and son completely believe in their daughter-in-law's words. I am now branded as a thief. And that, too, from Dan, whom I've been with for so many years. I thought Dan was the only one on my side. But the reality was different. On the way back from our son and his wife's baby shower, I was in high spirits. What was I thinking? As I heard Dan's angry voice, I wanted to cry. Indeed, I had a bad relationship with Kathy, my son's wife. But I never imagined things would turn this bad. Kathy even said that I stole $1,500 from the money sent to them. Of course, I have no recollection of that. Our son Victor is frail and his job is unstable. I was grateful to Kathy for supporting Victor. But now, it's too much. I won't forgive Kathy, who called me a thief, nor Dan, who believed her without any doubt. Victor said he had someone he wanted me to meet. Realizing it was a girlfriend, my husband and I were overjoyed. Victor has always been physically weak, often missing school during his student days. Now at 26, he had grown up. He got a job but was still often sick. I thought marriage would be difficult for him. But then he had a girlfriend. Surprised and relieved that my worries were unnecessary, I told Victor I want to meet her soon. He brought Kathy the following Sunday. Kathy was fair-skinned, dressed simply yet stylishly, a slender and fashionable beauty. She brought baked sweets as a gift. Both working in DC seemed sophisticated, and I was impressed. I'm Kathy Morgan. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. It's good you could come. May I ask how you and Victor met? Mom. Please stop. Oh, it's fine. I met Victor at work, where he taught me as my senior. Kathy, blushing but speaking clearly, made a good impression. Dan and I, being laid back, admired her efficient aura. I imagined Kathy becoming part of our family. Not just me. Kathy, Victor, and even Dan. We all sensed a happy future. It was such a day. Things started going wrong after Victor and Kathy began living together. My name is Helen Reed. This March, I turned 51. Living with my husband Dan, a year older than me. Dan got a job right after high school and we fell in love when I was his junior at work. He continued working there even after I left. Our son Victor graduated from a prestigious university. Our pride and joy. But his student loan repayment seemed tough. So I continued sending him money even after his graduation. My concern was that the amount, initially small, was gradually increasing. Victor, looking guilty but never refusing, continued accepting the money even after paying off his loans. Upon checking my bank account one day, I was shocked at how little was left. When had it decreased so much? I had been careful to send Victor a reasonable amount for his allowance. About that. I had come home and discussed the matter with Dan in a flustered state. However, Dan was unfazed and then he said something unbelievable. Since Victor got a girlfriend, he must need money. I wanted to help him out, so I just transferred a large amount to him. It's from my feelings. What are you talking about? I felt dizzy. I couldn't believe Dan had transferred money without my consent. And the amount was $1,500. A significant sum. I scolded Dan, but it had no effect. He remained nonchalant. Think about how much our dates cost every month. A man has to maintain his pride. I can't let Kathy see us as poor. I was speechless at his reasoning. The next day, Kathy called. I can't accept such a large amount of money. Kathy. That money was prepared by my husband, thinking of our son. I couldn't bring myself to speak ill of my husband, so I responded like that. Kathy repeated her thanks and apologies. Even combining their incomes, they were still struggling financially. I sympathized with Kathy and told her she didn't need to return the money. Deep down, I was shaken by the large amount, but more than that, I couldn't bear to see my son and his girlfriend suffering. Victor thanked me. Since then, Victor had come to expect the $1,500 allowance. Dan continued sending it, satisfied. I couldn't stop them. After much thought, I decided to take a part-time job at a nearby supermarket. It was tough getting hired at my age, but I managed to land the job after much pleading. Thanks to Dan's transfers, it seemed like my son's life had become easier. There was an invitation to go barbecuing next weekend. My husband immediately agreed. I felt conflicted. That money was earned through our hard work, yet Victor acted as if it had always been his. But since Dan had agreed, there was nothing I could do. Besides, I wanted to see Victor and Kathy. We drove separately to the campsite and met up with Victor and Kathy. They had brought the ingredients. Sorry for the typical selection. Nice meat. Looks delicious. Kathy was modest, and Dan responded with a happy smile. He was friendly towards Kathy. He seemed to already consider her part of the family. There were moments of discomfort for Kathy due to his familiarity. But Victor and I smoothed things over. We could become a close-knit family. Yet, I felt a slight chill in Dan's behavior. He became lenient whenever Kathy was involved. Sometimes I even wondered if he had ulterior motives. Of course, I trust my husband. Kathy is responsible. Nothing will go wrong. Now, Dan and Kathy were grilling the meat together. Kathy choked on the smoke, and Dan laughed. Victor had retreated to the shade. He was on his smartphone, not participating in the conversation. Victor, why don't you help out a bit? No need. Dad will handle it. I wondered when Victor became so indifferent. Kathy is not Dan's girlfriend. She is Victor's. Yet, Victor leaves her with his father and busies himself with smartphone games. He always liked games. But it seemed to get worse after he started playing smartphone games as an adult. I didn't voice my concerns. Perhaps that was for the best. After the meal, Victor and Kathy went for a walk around the campsite. Seeing them close from afar, I finally felt relieved. Since that day, Victor and Kathy started spending their weekends with us. I was often too busy with my part-time job to join them. Kathy helped with household chores, which I appreciated. I even thought how nice it would be if she became our daughter-in-law and lived with us. But they both work in the city, and it wouldn't be right for newlyweds to live with us. It seemed unlikely. Back then, I thought living together would be difficult in a good way. I trusted Kathy and Victor was my son after all. Even when I saw their faults, I turned a blind eye and preferred to see the good in them. That was until then. What is this all about? I came home and was screaming. The trinkets I had displayed in the entranceway were completely gone. Kathy cleaned up. Cleaned up? Those were souvenirs from our trips. You can't just do whatever you want with them. I wondered where they were put. In response to my panic, Dan just sat heavily on the sofa and said. She asked if she could throw them away, and I said sure. Why would you do that? I was shocked. Not only that my memorabilia thrown away without my consent, but also because they seemed unimportant to Dan. They were chosen by Dan on our first trip together. Kathy appeared from the kitchen. Is something wrong? Kathy, this is too much. Throwing away someone else's belongings. I'm sorry. But I've been thinking for a while. Your house, well, it seems to have too many things. Kathy's tone was firm. She didn't like being accused of doing things on her own. In reality, she had gotten permission from Dan, so in her view, she hadn't disposed of anything without consent. After this incident, I frequently found that dolls and vases that decorated our rooms had disappeared. I learned from Victor that Kathy is a minimalist and has always complained about the clutter in our house. Clutter. That's how she saw it. But to me, each item was precious. To Dan, it seemed not to matter. He laughed and said, "Kathy's into SNS, you know. Something about how a modern girl conquers a hoarder's house and turns it into a stylish space. Calling it a hoarder's house is a bit much, though. So that's the kind of person she is." I was disappointed in Kathy. She stopped smiling like before and quickly prepared to leave when I came home, whispering something to Victor. Is this what mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationships are like? I was sad. But the greatest sorrow was not because of Kathy. Dan. You, who laughed and allowed our precious memories to be thrown away, I couldn't believe it. Even as my relationship with Kathy worsened, Victor continued dating her. Eventually, they got married, and Kathy became the daughter-in-law of this house. The last time I saw Kathy was at their wedding. Victor's car would still come to our house on weekends. But Kathy was not there. "Where's Kathy?" Asking casually, Victor approached me, his face red with an uncharacteristic fury. He thrust his smartphone screen at me. Is this your doing, Mom? What are you talking about?" I was completely clueless. As I tilted my head, Victor nearly yelled. Recently, Kathy's online posts have been attracting a troll. Using the pen name Helen. That's not you, is it? Don't be ridiculous. My heart nearly stopped. I stared at the screen. Indeed, there was one person consistently responding negatively, even aggressively, to Kathy's posts. Initially, the comments seemed to mix complaints and criticisms. Like, calling it a hoarder's house is too much. Or, it's mean to call your husband's family home a hoarder's house. But they escalated over time, now outright attacking Kathy's character. Kathy's absence might be because she suspects me. I need to clear up this misunderstanding. Dan, standing beside me with crossed arms, asked in a pained voice. "Helen, what's this about? What do you mean? You suspect me too?" Once again, Dan sided with Kathy, not me. I looked at him, feeling sad. She's like a daughter to me. I wouldn't speak ill of her. Then who is this person? I don't know. I shouted and ran from the entrance hall to my room, tears overflowing. I grabbed my pillow and cried. After some time, I realized the room had darkened. It was already evening. I heard Victor's voice through the sliding door. "Mom, I'm sorry. You wouldn't do something like that. Kathy's suffering from severe morning sickness right now. She's pregnant. We've both been on edge." "Sorry." I lifted my head. "Pregnant. Kathy is." I shakily got up and moved towards the sliding door. Victor was gone. Instead, Dan stood there, looking displeased. "Isn't dinner ready yet?" I began to think that maybe I didn't matter to Dan. This feeling became reality the day Kathy gave birth to our granddaughter and we went to celebrate. Kathy, whom I hadn't seen in a while, still wouldn't look at me. I couldn't find words beyond a simple, "You must have had a hard time." The awkward visit ended, and on the way back, driving, Dan seemed lost in thought. "The baby was adorable, wasn't she?" "Yeah." His response was distant. He had been like this since seeing his grandchild. "Dan." Kathy mentioned something. "Yes." Dan looked at me. Suddenly, he exploded with anger, without any warning. "You've been stealing $1,500 from the money I sent. Today's the day we divorce. Aren't you ashamed as a mother-in-law? Apologize to Kathy." I was speechless. "What are you talking about, Dan?" I had no recollection of this accusation. Me, stealing the allowance money? But it seemed Dan believed Kathy's story. Did Kathy dislike me so much to lie about me? Dan, too, was unbelievable. Believing his son's wife over me, his wife of many years. What did our years together as a couple mean? Something inside me shattered. I took a deep breath and said to my husband with all the breath I exhaled, "Fine, let's divorce. But are you sure you won't regret it?" Regret? Ha! As if I'd regret leaving a thief. Dan spat out, unable to bear being with a thief like me. I sighed again. It's over then. Yes, it's over. Want to get out of the car now? Maybe. Most of my belongings were deemed trash by Kathy and Dan and thrown away. There's nothing left in that house to evoke any memories. Return the stolen money. Okay. Fortunately, I wasn't struggling financially. I had been secretly contemplating divorce. And had been saving some of my part-time income each month. There was no need to steal. I pulled an envelope from my bag, prepared to bring up divorce anytime. I spread $1,500 in front of the man who was once my husband. This should be fine. Goodbye. You had it all along. Dan got angry again. He still thought of me as a thief. I couldn't find the will to say anything more. After that, I moved into an apartment by myself. Victor helped with the move. Kathy and Dan didn't show their faces. Naturally. They were united in a negative alliance. I can't believe this happened. Because of Kathy. It's all right. By the way, Victor, how do you post on the internet? While surrounded by moving boxes, I asked. Victor, surprised, showed me how to download an app and taught me. From that day, I started checking social media whenever I could. Though I didn't follow her, I still looked at Kathy's posts. Kathy had over 2,000 followers. Recently, her posts were mainly about being oppressed by her mother-in-law. In Kathy's mind, I was a woman who hoarded trash and became hysterical and violent when someone tried to clean it. She even created a narrative that Dan and I hadn't divorced yet, and were living with our son and his wife. In reality, Dan and I divorced soon after separating on the way home. And he wasn't living with his son and wife. I created my account. The name was I Am Innocent. Initially, my posts were about confronting the delusions of my former daughter-in-law. But that didn't attract followers. After some thought, I started posting about the advantages and disadvantages of living alone. Interactions with my landlord, and tips for quick cooking, aiming to draw interest. Gradually, my followers increased, reaching a little over 100. I was happy. In the beginning, most of my followers commented, encouraging me not to lose to my ex-daughter-in-law. Among them was Helen. Whether he or she, I didn't know, but Helen commented, "That demon of an ex-daughter-in-law you're fighting against must be you. Keep it up." This comment energized me. I posted about my daily meals, walks, and events at my part-time job. I looked for incidents that could make interesting stories, and added insightful details to engage my readers. My follower count continued to rise. Eventually, my followers started a support group for me. The commotion even made it to the news. Of course, it was only a brief segment on a local TV station, but to me, it was a monumental event. People in my neighborhood seemed to realize who the online battle was between. As we passed by each other, they began to say, "Don't give up," along with their greetings. My followers surged. 5,022 people. I had far surpassed Kathy. A few days after this incident, Victor came to visit. My son bowed his head to me. "I'm sorry about Kathy. I never thought she'd make such a big deal of it. But since it was revealed, she's been shunned by the neighbors. Can you forgive her?" "I can. But why doesn't Kathy come herself?" I voiced what seemed like an obvious question. Victor held his head in frustration and left. That night, Kathy called me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just felt so good being pitted, I couldn't stop. You made this mess, now you need to take responsibility for it. Victor wasn't planning to divorce Kathy. He said it would be too hard on their child. I too thought of my grandchild. Being known as the bad mother would be harmful as my grandchild grows up. I carefully chose my words for my next post. It seems there was a misunderstanding between my ex-daughter-in-law and me. We have talked and made up now. Sorry for the trouble. Months after this post, the commotion surrounding Kathy and me finally settled down. After Kathy's trouble subsided, I asked Victor about Dan. Victor grimaced as he spoke. Dad? He's in a bad state. He can't cook on his own, and he refuses to live with us. He used to get along with Kathy, right? Well, Kathy doesn't even let him keep the TV at home anymore. I'm fine with just my smartphone, but Dad probably wants to watch baseball and the news, right? That's ridiculous. To Kathy, even modern conveniences were a nuisance. From her perspective, our house must have indeed looked like a hoarder's house. It seemed that the old interactions were gone, and now Victor occasionally visits Dan alone. Dan, unable to handle household chores, has laundry scattered everywhere and survives on convenience store rice balls. Kathy cooks and sends meals with Victor only on days she can manage. But since the incident, she's been emotionally down and unlikely to have the energy to cook regularly. I decided to visit Dan after a long time. But to avoid a hostile atmosphere, I arranged to go with Victor. Dad. It's me. He called out at the door. No response. A bad feeling crept over me, and I reached for the doorknob. Dan. Are you there? Still no reply. Victor used his key to open the door. I rushed down the hallway, forgetting to even take off my shoes. There was an unpleasant smell. As Victor had said, there were clothes scattered everywhere. Dan. My voice was tinged with a scream. Dan was lying on the floor. Dan, hold on. Dad. We need to call an ambulance. While Victor was arranging for an ambulance on his smartphone, I stayed by Dan's side. Dan was crying with his eyes closed. Helen, come back. Helen. I looked away gently. At the hospital, he was diagnosed with malnutrition. Victor's face was pale, but he still acted like the adult present. Mom, you don't have to worry about Dad anymore. You're not obligated. I can't just ignore it after finding him like that. I forced a smile. Dan, the $1,500 you accused me of stealing was used for your hospital bills. Are you still going to call me a thief? I saved the life of my ex-husband using the money I was wrongly accused of taking. When Dan woke up and saw me, he started crying again. Helen. You came back. I just came to check on you with Victor. I never thought you'd collapse from malnutrition. Despite his lack of interest in household chores, he managed when he was single. At least his apartment wasn't a mess when we first dated. Did I spoil you too much, Dan? I heard from Kathy, it was all lies. I'm sorry for doubting you. Please come back. I can't do that. I spoke firmly, not to be swayed by Dan again. I asked if you would regret it. You said you wouldn't. I was deceived by Kathy. You must take responsibility for your own words. Once I paid the hospital bills, my obligations to Dan were over. No feelings remained. Just like Dan threw away my memories, I threw him away. I'll never return to that house. I left the hospital room. Dan's calling out for me could be heard, but I didn't look back. Dan was taken in by Victor's family. Kathy, as atonement, is making healthy meals every day. I heard she closed her SNS account. Occasionally, Victor invites me to join them for meals, but I never agree. I'll just accept the thought. However, I regularly visit my granddaughter, Nicole. She resembles Victor when he was young. I keep in touch only with Nicole and Victor, her chaperone. Victor sometimes updates me about Dan and Kathy. Honestly, I find neither of their stories interesting. It seems I'm more affected by having my memories thrown away than I thought. At the same time, losing those keepsakes helped me sort out my feelings. I'll never stand at the doorstep of that house again. I continue to post online. I changed my account name to Auntie's Musings. Now, I share life hacks with my followers, which seems to be well received as my follower count keeps growing. Nicole will start elementary school next year. I decided to get her a school bag. We went to the store in Victor's car, and Nicole chose her favorite bag. She picked a light blue one. I thought it unusual for a girl, but Victor explained that nowadays, children are not confined by gender in their choices. I nodded and presented the bag to my granddaughter. Thank you, Grandma. I'm glad we found a bag that suits you, Nicole. Yes. Nicole seemed happy. Victor and I exchanged smiles.